After you pray, when you start with a passage, the first thing that you want to do when you're studying the Bible is to observe the text. But the problem is there are so many things that you might observe. And if I were just to tell you to open to a passage and tell you to start observing, you would probably get overwhelmed or have no idea what it is that you're supposed to be looking for. So this annotation system has been developed in order to give you a lot of the things, maybe not everything, but a lot of the things that you should be observing when you look at the text. Now, first of all, this annotation system, there's a chart here on the screen. You need to have that available to you. So if you look at the bottom right corner, you see that my email address is there, hiddentreasurebible@gmail.com. If you email me, I will be happy to send you this chart along with a little guide for free. When you're looking at the annotation charts, there are three aspects that you should notice. Actually, there's four, but there's three in the two charts that are at the top. So first, obviously, you notice the colors, the 7 colors of the rainbow, along with white. So there's 8 colors altogether. Second of all, you should notice that there are two charts, and in the top right left corner of each of the charts, there is a symbol there. And it tells you what symbol you're supposed to use for each one of these charts. It's different for the top chart and the bottom chart. So for example, in the top chart, it says X plus circle in the text. So that means that when you are using the top chart, you're always going to be using an X as the symbol to remind you that it's for the top chart. In the bottom chart, it says to highlight in the text or to put a dot, and I'll show you what that means. But this is the one that you highlight in the text. So anytime that you see a highlight in the text, that should tell you to go back to the bottom chart to figure out what it is. Or when you're looking at the bottom chart, you should know that you will be highlighting in the text for the things in the bottom chart. The third thing I want you to notice is that some of the lines are underlined and some of them are not. So on the top chart, the top line is not underlined, and on the bottom chart, the top line is not underlined. And then on both charts, the bottom line is underlined for each one. This just gives us more opportunity to use things in those charts, in those categories. And so that's how you distinguish from one thing or another. Okay, you have to find what chart is it in, and therefore what symbol do you use? What color is it under? And is it underlined or not underlined? And that will give you what annotation you should be using when you're trying to mark that category in the text. Now, also you should notice that at the bottom, there are a few other annotations that I call the meta annotations. So the top chart are called the basic questions, like who, what, when, where, why. The second chart is called the structural details. And then the bottom part are called the meta annotations. These are ones that you'll find all over the text. Now, in order to make this more intuitive, I've tried to group things as much as possible by color so that you can remember things together. So here are the colors and the color schemes and the way that I envision it. All the things that are white, both in the top chart about basic questions and in the bottom chart about structural details, are connectors. For example, the basic question, to whom, which is not underlined and is white, so it's marked with an X, it's white and it's not underlined, is to whom. That connects an action with its receiver. Whose connects a person, an object, with another person that it belongs to, either in relationship or in possession with an object. For the bottom part, you see that the structural detail theme is not underlined and references and allusions is underlined. These also connect because if you have a theme in one part of the scripture text and you have the same theme in another scripture text, like in a different book or something like that, those two passages should be looked at side by side to see how that theme is being discussed. References and allusions means things that are referenced to other parts, for example, of the Bible or other things that happen in history. So again, this is connecting two texts or two events together. Okay, now the yellow ones are the most important things that you're looking for in the text. You see that the basic questions, the one that's marked with an X, is yellow, and you see that it's who, both who outward, things like the physical description, the job, title, social status, and then who inward, this person's habits and personalities, things like that. You want to keep those things separate because they tell us different things, and sometimes they have different effects on the text. The structural details that are yellow are the main idea, which is the thing that you would expect when you highlight something yellow, that it's the most important thing. So that's what we're doing here. And then yellow highlight with an underline is the key terms. So these are words that have a special meaning for the human author. And a lot of times it's a meaning that can be gotten wrong, and when a person gets it wrong, it makes them misunderstand the rest of the text. We'll talk about how to find these things and how to get them correct later on, but that's what a key term is. Now, the orange annotations have to do with action. So you see that the basic questions are what happened and what else happened. So when you're doing the text, you're going to want to mark what happened with an X, highlight it orange, highlight the X orange on the outside of the text, and that will give you a great way to look back when you're done reading to find the plot. Now, sometimes the action helps to lead to the climax or the resolution of the story. And if that's the case, that should be a more important thing. Other times, the human author puts in details that don't lead towards the climax or the resolution of the story. And we want to notice those things too. And so we're going to distinguish them by putting an underline under the X that's highlighted orange for a less important action. What else happened? For the structural details, when we see important changes, we're going to highlight it orange in the text. And when we see a person make an important choice, which means they could have gone one way or another way, when we see that, we're going to highlight it orange and then underline it in the text. The blue categories have to do with reasoning. Okay, so the basic question for blue is why. And then probably in some ways the most important annotation out there is the blue X that is underlined, which is what's at stake. When you see that one, you really want to notice that because that's extremely important in the text. The blue structural details have to do with the way we think or the way we know things. So when you highlight blue, that means evidence. That means that somebody is trying to convince somebody else to do something or to believe something. And it might be somebody in the text trying to convince somebody else in the text to do something. It might be a human person trying to convince God to do something, like in prayer. Or it might be the human author trying to convince his readers to do something. Any of those things can be evidence. The fourth one, the one that is highlighted blue in the text and then underlined, is what I call assumptions and presumptions. So an assumption is like a cultural assumption. We're going to talk about a lot of the cultural assumptions that the human authors and the audience, the original audience of the books of the Bible, had, and how that affects the way they wrote and what we should get from it in the text. But those cultural assumptions you want to notice, and so you're going to highlight it blue and then underline it. But also there's things that are like we would call presumptions, which means things that everybody would kind of like assume or presume to be true without even thinking about it, that a lot of times affects the people in the text, usually in a negative way, to be honest. Okay, and again, we'll look at some of these later on. Okay, now with the red and the green categories, they kind of go together as a pair. They're opposites most of the time. Okay, so for example, red, the basic question for red with an X and not underline is when. And then the basic question for green is where. When and where. They're kind of opposites of each other when it comes to setting. How did it end? What's the legacy? That is red with an X that's underlined. And then how did it begin? What's the background? That is a green X that's underlined. And the idea for those two especially has to do with stoplights, right? At least in America, a red stoplight means stop, end, and a green stoplight means go, begin. So I'm trying to connect those together. The structural details for red highlight in the text is contrasts and differences. And then the green one is similarities, comparisons, analogies. So again, you see that those are opposites of one another. Now, the last one, the red highlight with an underline and the green highlight with an underline, they kind of go along with the contrast and the similarity. Okay. There's differences. He has red hair and he has blonde hair. And then there's differences. People fighting with each other, conflicting with each other. So because that kind of goes with contrast, we're going to put that with a red highlight and underline. Examples and lists goes with similarities because that has to do with a category and a species of the category, an example in the category, right? So if you have dogs, an example of dogs would be dachshunds, bloodhounds, Dalmatians. Those are all examples of dogs. And anytime you see a list, that's always a list of a group of things that are somehow connected together as examples of a category, some kind of category that's there. All right, now I wasn't able to get the purple and the pink quite to go together for the entire category, but at least the basic questions have their own special one, and then the structural details do for each of those categories. So for purple, the basic questions are about modifiers, adjectives, and adverbs. So, and by the way, this could be adjectives and adverbs that are single words, but it also could be phrases as well. So the purple X without an underline is how, to what extent. And then the purple X with an underline is what kind of, which one. So the top one would be adverbs, the bottom one would be adjectives. For the purple structural details, we have things that are out of place. And there's two ways that things might be out of place. It might be a thing that is there that seems like it shouldn't be there, or it could be a thing that should be there and is missing. So that's what this category notices. When you highlight something purple, you're noticing that something is unique, strange, out of place, weird, singular. Anytime I see a miracle, I always highlight it purple. And then whenever I see something hidden or missing, something that I feel like there's something that should be there and it's not there, I'll highlight it purple and I will underline it. Finally, we have the miscellaneous, the pink categories. The top one is miscellaneous, the X categories, the basic questions. Under what circumstances is an X highlighted pink without an underline, and then how many or how much. So a lot of times you'll see things like all, every, some, never, or an amount. You'll see that. A lot of times you'll see things with money. Those things would be how many and how much. A pink highlight with an X that is underlined. And then finally, the last category is the structural details for pink. And that's things that make you feel. So anytime you see something that is an emotion, a person experiencing an emotion like anger, sadness, joy, you're going to highlight in the text pink. And anytime you see any kind of details that give the atmosphere or mood, you're going to highlight that pink. Okay, that's the pink without an underline. Sorry, that's the highlight without an underline. And then finally, the last little category here is when you highlight in the text pink and you underline it. And that would be interesting wording or figurative language. The Bible has all kinds of figurative language all over the text. There's all kinds of things. And what we mean by figurative language is this. Anytime the text says something that when you read it just exactly as it's read, it doesn't mean it that way. Okay, anytime that there's an exaggeration or something that's implied, anything like that is figurative language. And you want to notice these things. One of the things that I've noticed by having this category, I had never noticed before how much the Bible uses rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are found all over the Bible. And when you start looking for them, when you start noticing that there's figurative language, you will start seeing this rhetorical language and other kinds of figurative language all over the Bible. All right, so let me show you now how this works. Hopefully you already have the chart so you can, and by the way, there's the email address there at the bottom again, hiddentreasurebible@gmail.com. You can email me and I'm going to send you this for free. So here's what a text looks like when you annotate it. Okay, now this is maybe not fully annotated, but there's a lot here. And so I want to just show you some of the things that are here. Actually, let me go back because I forgot to talk about the meta annotations. So let's talk about those meta annotations. So first of all, at the top of the section, you are going to put what I call a guiding question. The guiding question is the main question that the section answers. Here's what I mean by that. When you read the question, okay, if you do this question well, and you read that question first, and then you read the text, the guiding question should be answered by the section that you are reading. And I'll show you an example of that in just a minute here. Now, what you're going to do is, this one is really important. And I began to realize this as a teacher, that this is how people teach, right? If a history teacher was teaching about the Civil War, and let's say, you break it down into different sections. So maybe you talk about Harper's Ferry, or you might talk about Gettysburg or something like that, right? What you're doing is the teacher is answering a question when he gives you a lesson. Each section in the Bible, I think, is being used like a lesson that the human author is trying to teach us. So we want to figure out, what is the question that he's trying to answer as he's giving us the text, because that will give us a great way to orient ourselves when we go back to the text, because you're going to be looking at the Bible all the time, and you're going to go back to these things all the time. So you want to figure out, what is the question that in this section the human author is answering. And if you do a good job with that, not only will you have something to orient you when you go back, but also it will help you figure out, what is the main idea? What are the 2, 3, 4 little things in this text that you want to highlight yellow? Because again, if you've answered that question, or if you've written that question well, correctly, if you've done it in a way that makes sense, then not only will your whole section be answered by the guiding question, but your main idea passages that you highlight yellow will also be answered by the will also answer the guiding question. Okay, so this guiding question is extremely helpful, and I'll show you what that looks like. Influence. What I mean by this usually is what we consider cause and effect, but cause and effect means this person does something and something happens as a result. I also want you to notice that influence happens. Sometimes a person says something and the other person might react or they might not react. So we're going to mark that with an arrow from the cause or the influencer to the effect or the person influenced. The next thing is the relation of thought in the same book. Sometimes what happens is the human author brings up some topic, and then he moves on to something else, and then later on he comes back to that original topic that was in the first section or the second section, and you want to notice when this happens. So what you're going to do is you're going to put a little jagged line between those two sections. Sometimes you might have to make a note, this is on this page, or it's this verse or this paragraph, something like that, but you want to be able to notice those things. There are 2 times that you're going to use a question mark in order to just note something very quickly in the text. A lot of times you're going to read something and you're going to say, what does this mean? And you're not going to have any idea what the text is talking about. You're going to annotate that with a question mark. And if you want to, you can put a little line from the question mark to the part that you are saying, what does this mean? The second thing is a double question mark, which means, why did the author think that this is important to include? Again, a lot of times you're going to be reading a text and there's going to be all kinds of things you're going to say, well, I understand what this means, but why is this here? Why did the author include this? So you want to notice those things because they're there for a reason. All scripture is inspired by God and profitable. That's what 2 Timothy 3 says. So you want to notice those things that you know what it means, but you don't understand why it's there, and come back to it later and start thinking about those things. And then finally, anytime you have any kind of open-ended question, you're going to want to write that down. You're just going to want to notice that in the text and write that down. All right, so that's all of the annotations. That's it. So here's what that looks like in the text. So first of all, if you notice, what I have at the top is a question that's highlighted yellow. That is my guiding question. And the question is, why is Mordecai important to the background situation of the book of Esther? When I first read this section, the first thing that I was looking for is, what is the main idea of this section and why is it here? Okay, why did the human author put this section here? And what I came up with is that the human author put this here to tell us about background stuff so that as we go through the text, we can know certain things, especially about Mordecai, about why Mordecai is important. Now, if you notice, what I have done is I have said that the first part of Esther chapter 11, starting verse 2 and going through the rest to verse 12, and then also Esther chapter 12, verses 1 through 6, I've actually decided that those two chapters or those two parts of chapters are one section, that they have one purpose in the text. You are certainly allowed to do that because the verse numbers and the chapter numbers that are in the Bible are not inspired. They were put in later by people, by clerics, trying to study the Bible and make it easier to reference things. And in my opinion, there are times that while they were trying to group things together by one idea, by times when the human author is answering one question, I think that in times they got it wrong. So what I've done right here at the bottom, or at the bottom, right above Esther chapter 1, is I have put a little line there. And that line is there to show that I believe this is one section, that it has one guiding question. Okay, now, when you look at this, just notice a couple of things. First of all, some things are highlighted in the text. Some things are annotated outside of the text with an X or with a question mark. And then there's other ones that have a dot that are outside of the text. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. But the ones that are outside of the text, so for example here, this red X, if you go back to the chart, a red X means when. And so when I look at the part that's circled in the text, I see the first day of Nisan. I know that that is an answer to the question, when. When I look at the pink X here on the outside of the text on the fourth line or third line, that's a circumstance question. Under what circumstance? And so if you look at the section there, you notice he was one of, and there's a whole part there about he was one of the captives whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had brought from Jerusalem. That's his circumstances. Okay. Now this also tells me something about who Mordecai is, and that is a who, his kind of cultural situation. So I've marked that with a yellow X right here, and a yellow X next to the pink X. So those things tell me about his circumstances and a little bit about who Mordecai is in his personality. So I also just want you to notice that some of the things don't have an underline. For example, the red X, the pink X, that's when and under what circumstances. This is the outward stuff of who, but some of the ones are underlined as well. So for example, there's this purple underline about 6 lines down, this purple X that's underlined. And if you go to the text where it's circled, it says ready to fight. This is talking about in the dream when the dragons came forth. They were what? What kind of dragons are they? They're dragons that are ready to fight. Okay, and so I'm noticing something about them, about what kind of dragons they are. What kind of is marked is an X that's marked with a purple highlight and underlined. Okay, you can also notice this here in the second paragraph about Mordecai. It says that he was faithful to the king. Now, where am I getting that from? There's a little line here from the X down to the orange choice here. And that's because he chose to tell the king about the plot against him rather than allowing him to be killed. That tells me something about who Mordecai is. Okay, so I see X's with an underline. I see X's without an underline. That tells me where on the chart I'm going and what, based on what color it is and whether it's underlined or not. And then again, just notice that the X's are marked outside of the text. And if you want to, I like to, but you don't have to, I like to circle in the text where the X is being answered, okay? Now, also notice that there are some of the structural details that are marked here. First of all, of course, the most important thing is the main idea. When I'm coming back to this text, the first thing I'm going to do is look at these yellow highlights that are in the text that are not underlined, because this gives me the main idea along with the guiding question about what is happening in this section. Everything else is details, but this is the main ideas, at least according to my interpretation. The next thing I'm going to look at, and you should notice, is that there are a few things on the right, both on the first paragraph and on the second paragraph, that are boxed, okay? These are theme structural details. These themes are, again, things that you can find both in the Bible, in other sections. You might find things about this in books about history or about philosophy. You might find things about this in science books, in sociology books, in psychology books. These kinds of themes will come up in a lot of different places. And so again, you want to notice those things, but the way that I show that is because it is, the structural detail would be a white, no underline. Well, there's no way you can do that. So what I do is actually box the themes. Whenever I notice them, I box them. And you really want to slow down and notice the themes, because that will really help you orient yourself when you come back to a text. Notice that I have a lot of other things here that are highlighted in the text. Notice here on the third and fourth line, I have something that is white. It's not underlined. I'm sorry, it's not highlighted, but it is underlined. So that would be the references and allusions. And notice what is being referenced here. It says, let's see, he was one of the captives whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had brought from Jerusalem with Jeconiah, king of Judea. So that tells me that there's a whole story here that maybe I don't know about. It may be in the Bible, it may not be. In this case, it is. But it's telling me that there might be something for me to look up later, an event in history or in some other literature, like, for example, in other parts of the Bible, that I'm going to want to look up. Notice that there is a purple highlight in the eighth line down. It says that they were ready to perish. What does that mean? I have no idea. That's a strange attitude to have, even in a dream, to say that they are ready to perish. That seems out of place. So I put a question mark there to go along with it. What does this mean? Why is this here? Like, what is this? Because I really don't know what he's trying to say in this text, and it seems out of place for anybody to say that the whole group of people is ready to perish. That seems out of place. Notice that I have some emotion and like atmosphere things that are highlighted. So, for example, here it says, after roaring, and at their roaring. So roaring, that is that gives me kind of a mood or an atmosphere that's going on in this dream. And then in a couple lines down from that, I also have, they feared the evils. So again, that tells me an emotion that's there. Notice again that some of the highlights, just like with the X's, some of the highlights don't have an underline and some of them do have an underline. So for example, this orange underline in the second little paragraph there about Mordecai, it says he sought all day to understand it in every detail. That orange highlight with an underline in the text is a choice. Why did he do that? Why does the author think that's important to include? So I put some question marks there at the end. Now, the other thing I want you to see is this. When you're doing structural details, there will be times that you have already highlighted the text, and then you realize that there is another structural detail included there as well. When that happens, you do not want to be double highlighting like a part of a text. That's going to be too confusing. It's going to be too messy. It's going to get you way confused. So instead, what I have started doing is I have a second annotation for the structural details. Whenever the text is available, like in the text, I highlight it. But if the text is already highlighted, I want to have an annotation on the outside of the text, something similar to these X's, to show that there is another structural detail here. Now, let me just give you one example, just so you can see what I mean here. If you look at the last line of the first paragraph, it says, light came, in verse 11, light came and the sun rose and the lowly were exalted and consumed those held in honor. Now, I've determined that that is part of the main idea of this dream. So I've already highlighted it yellow. But one of the things I've also noticed is that it talks about the idea of honor. Now, we're going to talk about cultural assumptions, but from my background, I know that honor and shame are a cultural assumption that is found in the ancient Near East, in the biblical times, the biblical people, all the time. So this is a cultural assumption that's being included in the text. But the problem is, I've already highlighted the word honor yellow as part of the main idea. So what I've done is I've, next to that part that I want, that line that I want to show that there is the structural detail of a cultural assumption, which is a blue highlight in the text with an underline. Instead of highlighting it blue in the text, I've highlighted blue on the outside of the text, still with the underline, because if it would be underlined if it was in the text. And since I can't just leave it like a blank highlight, I'm going to put a dot. A dot symbolizes to me a highlight in the text. I would have highlighted in the text if I could have, but because the text was already occupied with another highlight, I have to mark it this way on the outside of the text. Another example of this would be in the kind of the middle of the line here, where it says, and behold, a day of darkness. You should see a green highlight with an underline. A day of darkness and gloom, tribulation and distress, affliction and great tumult. Now, I've marked that down with a green highlight in the text with an underline, which is a list. There's a list of qualities here. But what kind of list is this? Well, this is a list of things that give the atmosphere for the dream. And so atmosphere would be a pink highlight in the text, but because I've already highlighted it green with an underline, instead I'm going to go outside the text, I'm going to highlight pink, and I'm going to put a little dot there to symbolize that I would be highlighting in the text if I could, if it was available, but I can't because it's already taken up. Okay, so this is how I annotate the text. And now what I have is a whole section of things, of questions that the text is answering, what the main idea of the text is. Also here at the bottom, I want you to notice some of the meta annotations. I have cause and effect, okay? If you look at the last paragraph here, from the third line of the last paragraph to the sixth line of the last paragraph, I have an arrow starting at the third line, going to the sixth line. And what I'm saying there is that something in the third line is causing something in the sixth line. The third line is about Mordecai reporting these people who were trying to kill the king. And then the sixth line is about the king recognizing Mordecai and giving him great honors. The cause is the fact that he reported them. The effect is that he is honored as well. Okay. Another one is found in the very last line of this section, right before Esther chapter 1. It says, because of the two eunuchs of the king, and then you see that there is an arrow pointing to he sought to injure Mordecai. This is talking about another one of the main people in the story, a guy named Haman. And you see that it's because of the two eunuchs of the king that he sought to injure Mordecai. Now, you see that I've circled it because that's a why question that tells us why he wanted to injure Mordecai. You see also on the outside of the line that I put a question mark. I don't understand right now why it is that what Mordecai did with the two eunuchs about reporting them to the king, why that would cause Haman to want to injure Mordecai. I don't know why that is. What does this mean? And therefore, I put a question mark there along with the why question to show that this is a question, but I don't know the why. I don't understand something that's going on there. Okay, so we got a lot of the meta annotations. You see the highlights for the structural details. You see how the structural details are marked on the outside of the text, and you see how the basic questions are always marked on the outside of the text. Now, I know that there might be a lot here. You might be a little bit overwhelmed, and I'm going to go through each of these annotations separately in like individual videos in order to help integrate these into your Bible study. For now, if you have any questions, and again, if you want to get that the guide, the chart that has all these annotations on it, please email me at the email address that's there at the bottom right, hiddentreasurebible@gmail.com. Bible study, this is a lot at the beginning, but just like anything that is important, once you start doing it, it gets easier, and all of the things that are hard will become easier as we go on. This is too important to not do this. Okay, we want to hear God's word, and I know you can do this. So God bless you guys, and good luck. Email me when you have questions.